socialism with democracy in the repressive political atmosphere of the post-1980 coup d'etat in Turkey. Sungur Savran, one of the important writers of the journal, say that 11. Tez represented a manifesto against two other left-wing journals in that period published in Turkey. The liberal leftist Yeni Gündem, published by Murat Belge, representing the civil society term, basically in the left, and the Stalinist Kemalist Saçak, published by Doğu Perinçek at that time. 11. Tez is also a very important journal for me, as I first met Atila Hoca in that journal through his articles before we met personally, on the critical analysis on brand reports in Socialist International. In these articles, Atila Hoca was problematizing how Socialist International was powerfully challenging the emergent neoliberal, ideology in that period in rise, without, however, problematizing how they neglect, basically, the historically specific conditions in the southern countries. So a critical perspective was clearly there. After a rather conventional IR undergraduate instruction in Mülkiye, his writings had enabled me to recognize quite happily the political economy route within the IR discipline, and that route has shaped my critical methodological stand since then throughout all my academic life. I would like to thank Atila Hoca primarily for this decisive footprint in my life, in my academic life. Besides, he has been the one to make me recognize the importance of institutions, administrative responsibility, and egalitarianism, university culture. I've been very lucky to have him both as a teacher and as a colleague since the start of my academic career. And I wish this won't change after his semi-retirement. For I personally need this more than ever, possibly, in those turbulent days, years that we have been passing through in Turkey once again. Now I would like to give the floor to Zülfü Faydın, Şevket Pamuk, and Galip Yanman, who have been vigorously analyzing social and political transformations taking place in world capitalism since their 11. Tez years. Today, we will have the privilege to listen to their most recent studies, on the recent political economy debates in their own fields. And our first speaker will be Zülfü Faydın with his discussion on the agricultural transformation.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm very pleased and honored to be here to participate in this conference organized in honor of Professor Atila Eralp. I met Atila Eralp in 1979 when I was a postgraduate student in England, and I received a letter from now a professor here, Ayşe Ayata, saying that we are organizing a student workshop. Would you like to participate? So I did. I went to Ayşe's university, which was Kent University in Canterbury, where I met Atila via my friend Galip Yanman. And therefore I am also grateful to Galip Yanman to introduce me to such a great friend like Atila. As you can tell from the title of my presentation is not on the European Union. I could have done something because Atila and I participated in a conference in Czech Republic, sorry. And then I did talk about Czech Republic, not Czechoslovakia. And I presented a paper there on the harmonization of Turkish agriculture to the acquis communautaire of European Union. But today my title is different because this title also reflects another aspect of Atila Eralp's life. And as Pınar mentioned, from 1984 onwards, Atila Eralp and a number of other colleagues, Sungur Savran, Tülay Arın, Şevket Pamuk, Korkut Boratav, Halil Gülap, Galip Yalman, Cengiz Arın, Nail Saklıgan, Ahmet Tonak ve Gülnur Savran. Bu arkada, sorry, since the names are in Turkish, I'm tempted to talk in Turkish. They basically decided to analyze contemporary transformations from a historical materialist point of view. And they decided that the title of the journal they were going to sort of disseminate their knowledge and interpretation would be the 11th thesis. Obviously, as you all know, 11th thesis is on against the German ideologist Feuerbach. And this title of our journal, the 11th thesis, also appears on Humboldt University's gate in Berlin, 11th thesis. So my title is Turkish Agrarian Transformation, simply because within the pages of the 11th thesis, I did write, I think, 3 articles on the agrarian question, developing countries, underdeveloped countries, and contemporary Turkey. And I got involved in a debate with our, what's the word, Ustad? Korkut Boratav. I was only in my 30s. I challenged Korkut Boratav in those days, but it generated a lively debate. So I'm going to basically present a new paper building upon those papers, and so I'm going to use the PowerPoint, if I may. Now, the original article was on the agrarian question. Agrarian question was quite significant amongst Marxists because there was a belief that for capitalism develop and then socialism to evolve from such thing, pre-capitalist forms of production had to be eliminated. And therefore, the widespread nature of small-scale producers in many developing countries basically constitute a significant problem simply because there was a belief that if peasantry continued to exist, capitalism would not develop properly and socialism would not evolve from that. And such debates were taking place in the 19th century, but contemporary debates also were a reflection of those early debates and so on. So there were 2 significant sort of positions within the debate in the particularly 1970s and 80s. There was a Marxist interpretation that Marxists thought that peasantry as a pre-capitalist form of production would inevitably disappear. But looking at the sort of empirical situation, there was the observation that peasantry still continued to, or family producers, small-scale producers, continue to exist, even in Western Europe, countries like Greece, Portugal, France, and Spain, and so on. So there was this really issue, whether or not peasantry would disappear, or Karl Marx was wrong. So they had to make that decision, whether or not to challenge Karl Marx's ideas, or to interpret the contemporary forms of small-scale farmers using family labor and so on. And the debates in the 70s basically reflected a debate in the 1920s between Leninists and Shayanovians in Soviet Union as well. Leninists were simply saying that peasantry would disappear. Peasantry is in the process of differentiation. Therefore, we cannot really talk about a homogeneous class of peasantry. Poor peasantry, middle peasantry, and rich peasantry, and peasantry was highly differentiated. Whereas the Shayanov, the other Russian economist, was saying that no, peasantry basically was a mode of production or mode of economy, and it wasn't really differentiating. There is no need to evaluate the peasantry in class terms, and so on and so forth. And Shayanovian basically were insisting that despite the fact the the fact capitalism was developing and enlarging, the small-scale producers, the peasants, had the ability to survive and produce some survival strategies. And these debates went on in that form, and I entered the debate in the 70s, 80s within the pages of the 11th thesis, saying that this debate basically was a false debate between the Shayanovians and the Marxists. Why did I consider this debate as a false debate? As I said before, the slow decline of the peasantry basically gave the impression that the Marx was wrong. But this had to be really explained in terms of the policies implemented by either nation states or by international organizations such as the World Bank. In the 1970s, the World Bank and Keynesian policies basically emphasized family farms. Small-scale farms were supported by these organizations. Obviously, they were not really interested in reducing poverty and so on. The reason they were supporting small-scale farmers in the developing world were twofold. One reason was that if they supported these small-scale farmers, and they would be able to buy modern technologies, insecticides, pesticides, etc., etc. Therefore, international capital would have a larger market for the commodities, inputs produced for agricultural production. This was one reason. The other reason was that international organizations were simply scared of social tension in developing countries. Therefore, they wanted to form some kind of class alliance with the peasantry, and therefore small-scale farmers were being supported, giving credits and cheap inputs, and so on and so forth. So, the engagement with the agrarian question basically revolved around two interpretations. One was the Shayanovian Marxist interpretation that the peasantry, the small-scale farmers, had a logic of their own simply because they had non-capitalist cost calculations, and therefore they were able to develop survival strategy when they were facing capitalism. Whereas Leninists and neo-Leninists were saying that in the long run, peasantry was going to disappear from the earth. And as I said before, I found this debate highly inefficient because it was a false debate. I thought that the reason it was a false debate was related to the fact that the unit of analysis chosen by each sort of group of people. Shayanovians basically was taking family farms as unit of analysis. They were basically looking at the relations within the family farm, the drudgery of work, the division of labor within the family, and so on and so forth, and non-existence of capitalist cost calculation. And Shayanovian Marxists were simply saying that, well, peasantry are capable of self-exploitation. They would work extremely hard, and they wouldn't really consider, well, I worked 5 hours, therefore I should be receiving 200 liras for my work. They would work as hard as possible in order to make sure that their families will survive. People like Samir Amin and Kostas Nergopoulos basically fall within this sort of explanation that family farm basically is the most useful form of production for expansion of capitalism because of this self-exploitation notion that exists within the peasantry. So, therefore, here we have a notion of undifferentiated peasantry, as if peasantry is not really differentiated. And they are independent producers, they are using family farms, they are not using wage laborers, and despite the fact that they are market-oriented, they are buying things from the market, selling in the market, but they manage to simply survive because of their existence of their survival mentality. And there are other Shayanovian Marxists you can see in the list. I don't want to basically explain each sort of variations. within this theory, but the opposite sort of view is the neo-Leninist differentiation. Basically, they talk about the class polarization in agriculture, and expectation is that in the long run, even in agriculture, we will see the emergence of agrarian capitalists and the proletariat. The reason, as I said before, the main problem before within this debate is that Shayanovians were basically taking the family farm as the unit of analysis, but looking at the internal structures, internal relations, whereas Lenin and Leninists basically were taking the nation state as the unit of analysis. Basically looking at whether or not a particular mode of production was dominant there, what was the nature of the relations of production, and so on, so forth. Therefore, my starting point was the work of German Marxist Karl Kautsky. Sometimes he's called Renegade Kautsky. I wasn't really interested in on his renegade side, but I was basically interested in his methodological approach to the penetration of capitalism into developing countries. So penetration of capitalism into rural areas. Basically, what Kautsky was saying, in order to be able to understand the nature of capitalism within agriculture, we have to really consider the nature of agriculture itself. Because agriculture, the main means of production in agriculture is land. And land cannot be increased in size. You know, in industry, you can repeat the same factories in different parts of the world, whereas the land is obviously limited. And also agriculture depends on the vagaries of climate to a certain extent. Therefore, we have to really look at agriculture differently. If you want to see the differentiation, the penetration of capitalism into agriculture, we have to have a different methodology. What we have to do is to see to what extent and in what ways capital is penetrating agriculture and subordinating labor to its own requirements of accumulation. In other words, what Karl Kautsky was saying was that for capitalism to take place in agriculture, capitalism may not require the existence of wage laborers. And his argument, later on I discovered, was based on Karl Marx's distinction between real subsumption of labor and formal subsumption of labor. He makes this distinction in Grundrisse, and many people would not really know this distinction made by Karl Marx. Basically, Karl Marx in that distinction was saying that capitalism can control the labor either formally or informally. It formally means wage labor capital relationship. Informally, indirectly, capital can actually penetrate agriculture. And if you put these together with the specific features of the agrarian structures, rural structures, you will see it will make sense, because land could not be increased and so on and so forth. And therefore, the main feature of capitalism is the generalized commodity production. Such commodity production can take place under different forms of labor. And within the world now, there is not a single corner of the world which has not been influenced by commodity production and commoditization. Therefore, we cannot really talk about pre-capitalist modes of production existing in this part of the world, in that part of the world. Obviously, people like Korkut Baratov was at the time, in the 70s, arguing that he was basically looking at Turkish statistics and analyzing southeastern Turkey's socioeconomic structures, and he found large numbers of sharecroppers, and therefore he thought that semi-feudalism existed in southeastern Turkey because of the number of sharecroppers. They were not wage laborers. He was basically moving from the Karl Marx's view that capitalism has to be identified with the existence of wage labor. Whereas if you use Kautsky type of methodology, then you can actually tell that capital can control the labor in different forms, and agriculture is different in nature. And therefore, that was my point. And I basically told, I said in the debate that you cannot really look at southeastern Anatolia as separated from the rest of Turkey, separated from the rest of the global world, and so on. What is important is to try to see how capital, different forms of capital, can actually penetrate and control the labor, family labor, and so on. Therefore, contemporary Marxists have been basically analyzing small-scale producers as commodity producers, not as peasants who would just be using family labor, who would be basically producing for self-consumption and so on. And so, if you look at the contemporary times, you realize that actually agriculture has become internationalized. And such internationalization have been theorized by a number of people. For instance, World Systemic Analysis of Philip McMichael and Global Agri-Food Commodity Chain Systems of Bonanno and so on. And for them, now we are living in a globalized world, and in this globalized world, transnational corporations have become really predominant in terms of their penetration to every sphere of life, including agriculture. Therefore, the agrarian question, the original agrarian question, was based on the fate of peasantry. They say that well, the agrarian question should not concentrate on whether or not peasantry would exist to continue. That is really irrelevant. What is important is that how we should really restore national food system, how we should try to see how the forces of globalization is influencing agricultural production, how World Bank policies have been influencing basically the lives of ordinary people in rural areas who are using family labor. And therefore we should be concentrating on the nature of modernization of agriculture and whether or not such modernization is leading to land concentration and so on, and whether or not people are being forced into production of certain crops at the expense of neglecting the production of food crops, which is that is what's been taking place in Turkey. And if you look at the Turkish situation now, from the 1980s onwards, Turkey has become liberalized, and as a result of this liberalization, international institutions, they are the corporate agencies of capital, World Bank, IMF, the World Trade Organizations, have been basically emphasizing modernization of agriculture. And even the European Union, when they talk about the harmonization of Turkish agricultural structures to acquis communautaire, they are basically telling Turkey to liberalize the economy, liberalize agriculture, let the sort of transnational corporations to come and operate. And we realize that transnational corporations nowadays are controlling developing countries' agriculture indirectly. How? By imposing the production of certain types of crops. The state, not only in Turkey, obviously this applies to all developing countries, the state, those three international agencies, World Bank, IMF, and the World Trade Organization, plus the European Union, groups of countries, have been putting certain types of conditionalities on countries like Turkey. Those conditionalities have to be analyzed in terms of the expansion of neoliberalism. In the early stages of neoliberalism, we had something called Washington Consensus. Within the Washington Consensus, many developing countries indebted, needed to borrow money, were basically given certain conditionalities, economic conditionalities. You have to liberalize your economy, you have to cut down the subsidies given to your farmers, you have to sort of reduce the wages or slow down the rise of wages, interest rates, etc., etc. These economic conditionalities were basically designed to push countries into the production of certain agricultural commodities. For instance, as far as Turkey is concerned, Turkey was told to basically cut down the production of tobacco, production of sugar beet, and wheat production. And subsidies were basically cut down for these things. And instead, another new form of subsidy was introduced, direct income support. And then recently, Hausa model or regional agricultural model has been introduced, and support policies are designed to support production of certain agricultural commodities. And those commodities are usually commodities which are used by agro-industry. Turkey has been pushed not to produce tobacco, sugar beet, but to produce maize, for instance. Why maize? Because maize is used as a raw material for the production of artificial sweeteners. An artificial sweetener in Turkey is being produced by a big international company, Cargill. And the Cargill, therefore, doesn't want ordinary sugar to be produced in Turkey. And therefore, sugar production from sugar beet has to be cut down. And therefore, state basically imposes some sort of policies on the country, and then those areas, obviously, areas are under cultivation of sugar beet declines. The decline of sugar beet, decline of tobacco, decline of wheat production, and so on and so forth, has in turn generated transformations in the countryside. If you look at actually the statistical figures, you realize that large numbers of people have been migrating from rural areas to urban areas. The number of people engaged in agriculture has declined quite significantly. We call this process de-agrarianization and de-peasantization. In other words, agrarian structures do not really provide sufficient number of work for people. Large numbers of people are moving agriculture. And also, the peasant nature of people have been disappearing simply because everybody in the countryside have become involved in commodity production. For those things, I can suggest that Washington Consensus basically emphasized economic conditionalities, cut down subsidies and so on and so forth, but from 1990s onwards, we have post-Washington Consensus, because large numbers of countries in the world implemented Washington Consensus policies, structural adjustment policies, and the expected results were not out there. When the World Bank suggested structural adjustment policies, the expectation was simply poverty would be reduced, the incomes would increase, and economic growth would take place. These things didn't take place. And therefore, even people from within the World Bank, like Stiglitz, started to criticize World Bank policies. And as a result, the World Bank started to simply saying that, well, there's nothing wrong really with our structural adjustment policies. What is wrong is that developing countries do not have the enabling conditions for those policies to operate. What are those enabling conditions? Those conditions are that developing countries don't have the necessary socio-economic and political structures. Therefore, you have to have a better governance, good governance, and suddenly a new parliament came in. If you have better governance, new institutions, new laws and new rules, new regulations, obviously the structural adjustment policy would operate. As a result of this, all these laws and rules and regulations were passed under the influence of what you call post-Washington Consensus. We had 2000 Union of Agricultural Sales Cooperatives law. Basically, those cooperatives were minimized and then they didn't get any state help. You have sugar law, which enabled companies like Amilium, Cargill, Sunar, and so on to penetrate into the sugar sector in Turkey. When I'm talking about sugar, I just would like to emphasize one thing. Do you know the sugar we use in our teas and coffees? Normally, that sugar, according to European Union's law, should only maximum should contain 5% artificial sweetener. This was the case in Turkey, but Cargill put a lot of pressure on Turkish government when our Prime Minister, now he's our President, went to the United States of America. I don't know what's talked in behind the closed doors. When he came back, Turkish Parliament passed a new law, and the amount of artificial sweetener in Turkish sugar increased from 5% to 10%. Few years back, now we got about 30%. You know, each time our president or whatever, the prime minister went to, sorry, I meant to say prime minister, but he wasn't president at the time. It would have been somebody else. I mean, it didn't have to be the current president, but you know, whoever it was, simply because Turkey was following neoliberal policies. And now the amount of sugar, artificial sweetener has increased about 35%. And also, as you can see that all these laws and rules and regulations were basically passed to ensure that the Turkish agriculture has become commoditized and produces the commodities required by transnational corporations. Transnational corporations' dominance in agriculture is not limited to this, but also supermarketization has taken place. International capital also require fresh fruits and vegetables and so on. Through these laws and rules and regulations, when the conditions, weather conditions are, climate conditions are suitable, certain areas started to specialize in the production of marketable supermarket goods like tomatoes, peppers, and flowers, and so on. And South region, particularly the Mediterranean and the Aegean regions, specialize in these things. And under the, what you call it, greenhouse sort of conditions, those commodities are produced. And when those commodities are produced, the seeds used for tomato production, pepper production, or whatever vegetable production, are not the seeds generated locally. Basically, they are produced by transnational corporations such as Monsanto, DuPont, okay? And for those commodities to be produced, you have to use certain types of chemicals, and those chemicals are also produced by transnational corporations. And without using those chemicals, you will not be able to produce certain quality of crops. You have, I'm told that the time is over, just 1 minute, okay? And basically, transnational corporations have been able to dominate Turkish agriculture, and therefore the quality of products, quantity of products, the nature of products is determined. And our producers basically have been putting more and more labor into the production process, and therefore but benefit basically accumulates somewhere else. To conclude my talk, what I would like to emphasize is that the past debate on agrarian question is not really reflecting the reality, simply because the unit of analysis they take is either the nation state or family farm. What we require is to take the sort of working of capitalism within the global processes and try to see its influences at various levels, village level, local level, national, and also international level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hocam. I particularly welcome two sort of conclusions out of your talk. One is that renewed endeavor to think about what are the defining characteristics of capitalism in a particularly turbulent times like today, because we're, for instance, questioning whether there is any sort of organic political sort of structure or form within capitalism. So how we should relate capitalism to developing basically political transformation. Whether, for instance, the modern bourgeois state is a necessity for capitalism. So to think about these questions once more, maybe we need to really think about what really capitalism is, beyond some cliches that we tend to take for granted. And secondly, in the previous two panels, we discussed the Turkish-EU relations, mostly on a political terrain. However, there's also a socio-economic context to all these political relations. So without understanding, for instance, the socio-political, socio-economic transformations taking place in agriculture as such, for instance, possibly it's really hard to understand why the European linkage couldn't democratize Turkey, but maybe rather the counter results have been coming through. So I would like to give floor to Şevket for his vote.
Thank you very much. I'm also very happy and very honored to be here today. I met Atila Eralp almost 40 years ago at the end of the 1970s. We had both arrived at Ankara just after finishing our PhDs abroad, and we were just beginning our first academic jobs. He was here at METU, I was at the University of Ankara, and we quickly became friends. And of course, 40 years in Turkey is a long period, and these difficult waves of difficulty recur, and in the 1980s we had one of those again. And so we ended up, since the 1980s, in different cities, different locations. But we have, I'm proud to say, we have kept in touch. And METU for me is also like a second home. I came back in the 1990s to teach here, and part-time I taught in the economics department, and still always very happy to be back here. Today people talked about various qualities of Atila Eralp, and of course I admire his scholarship, I admire his contributions to the international relations literature, and to his studies on Turkey-EU relations. And a lot has been said today about those. But what impressed me, though during those years we lived in different parts of the world, in parts of the country, was that Atila was an institution builder. He contributed a lot to the emergence and development of the International Relations Department at METU. And I think that's something really to be proud of, because, you know, in Turkey, institutions do not last very long. We're again living in a period where institutions are being destroyed, are collapsing. So institutions matter, and Atila, I admire you also for your commitment to this institution, to your department and to your university. Now, I'm going to continue the earlier theme about EU-Turkey relations, but I am not a specialist on international relations literature. I'm going to talk about EU-Turkey relations from the perspective of an economic historian. And I want to begin with the recent AKP period, the last 15 years of the economy, Turkey's economy, during the AKP era. Of course, with time, it has become apparent to many that there were really two periods, two sub-periods in the AKP era with respect to the economy. And there were sharp contrasts. These were two very different periods. Let's say, arguably. The first period until 2007, more or less, and the second period since 2007, 2008, more or less. The first period was marked by a return to economic stability after the crisis of 2001, declining deficits, declining debt stock, and in retrospect, relatively high rates of increase in incomes and economic growth. AKP really didn't do very much except continue the 2001 program, but they did. Nobody has really claimed that AKP in those early years had an original or a different economic program. They just continued, but they certainly took advantage of the economic recovery that began as they came to power or just before they came to power. Now, the second period, since 2007, 2008, is very different. Domestic politics dominates the period since 2007, 2008. Domestic politics and the drive to consolidate AKP power and increasingly personal rule. When you look back, really since 2007, 2008, there has been very little concern for addressing medium, long-term economic problems such as employment creation, to deal with the declining savings rate, industrialization, and so on. The emphasis has been on the politics, on establishing control over the military, over the media, over the judiciary, and also, of course, also on establishing closer control over the economic institutions that were established as part of the 2001 program. So, you might say that in fact, this is a very, I think it's a very clear-cut picture. Politics has determined the economics in the AKP era, both in the first period, because it was a more pluralist, more open environment until 2007, and also since. The drive to consolidate power has determined what happened in the economy. And this is where I want to make the link with the EU. Because if we agree that the politics was really by far the determining factor, there was another political variable that one needs to take into account, or one can plausibly take into account. And that's the EU and the role of the EU. Let me say that, of course, I recognize this is not the only interpretation of the AKP era. There are many who would argue that there was a grand design of gradually taking over, consolidating power that was there, endemic at the very beginning. But my understanding of history is that a lot of these things are also contingent. It depends on what happens. A lot of these things are path-dependent. To use a favorite phrase. And I want to bring into the agenda, in this big contrast between the first period and the second period, I want to raise the issue whether there was some role here for the EU as well. So I want to begin by talking about the EU, in the role of the EU and the in the early period, in the first early period until 2007. The role of the EU in the design and implementation of the 2001 program and also in the early AKP years was actually very limited. Now, Zülküf has talked about some EU role in agricultural sector, but I would say that was the exception. If you look at the design of the 2001 program and then the AKP era from 2002 onwards, most of the negotiations with the international, most of the negotiations over economic policy and so on were being done with the IMF. And the EU had, in comparison, had much less direct influence on economic policies and the creation of new economic institutions and so on. So the influence of the EU until 2005, 2007 was mostly political. This perspective of Turkey's membership had created a very favorable, optimistic climate, and it was through those politics that Turkey's economy was favorably influenced during those early years, early AKP years. Plus, of course, there was, from 2005 on, there were, until the global crisis, large inflows of European foreign direct investment. But again, I think they only added, I think the key EU influence during those years was the membership perspective and the politics. So there was this mention that during this period, to use an IR phrase, there was not only there was an EU anchor behind the Turkish economy, but that anchor came through the politics and the membership perspective. However, in retrospect, we see quite well that already in 2004, key member states inside the European Union were already reluctant to accept Turkey as a member. Already in 2004. Already in 2004, Turkey's eventual membership was tied to this new phrase, absorption, EU absorption capacity, which was, there was the Copenhagen criteria, political economic criteria, and then there emerged a new phrase, EU's absorption capacity. Well, yes, certainly it was understandable. EU was experiencing what was called enlargement fatigue, and there were, EU accepted 10 new members in 2004 and 2 were added in 2007. And then, but after 2004, there were important change in government in 2 key member states inside the EU, and center-right governments came to power in Germany and France. Now, Merkel came to power in November 2005, And she made clear, especially in domestic politics, that her party and her government opposed Turkey's membership. And then in 2007, Sarkozy became president in France, and he began to state explicitly that Turkey did not belong to Europe, and that Turkey should not become a member, even if Turkey one day fulfills the Copenhagen criteria. And then from then on, once Sarkozy was president, Merkel let Sarkozy lead the way and the opposition to Turkey's membership. Now, I still think Turkey's domestic politics and the drive to power of AKP and the drive for consolidation of power by AKP is the main explanation, is a main explanation for the present state of Turkey-EU relations. But it is also true that Turkey's accession was never really given a chance. That I would say just as EU's position mattered until 2005-2006 in a positive way, this opposition by key EU member states, EU member state governments, played a negative role. And not only on the government, but also on, I would say, those the more democratic forces, those who favored greater integration with the EU, those who thought that EU membership would help Turkey's democracy in the longer run. So Turkey has been, you could say Turkey has been without an EU anchor in that. Turkey has been without an EU anchor since roughly 2007, and EU has lost whatever influence it had over Turkey since. And when you look at EU's relations with other candidate countries, this membership perspective was very important in their history, in their reforms, democratic reforms, economic reforms. But in Turkey's case, EU had very little positive role to play. And of course, without it, that kind of positive role becomes very difficult without a membership perspective. Now, 10 years later, we have really very little, we can't be very optimistic today about the future in the period ahead, about Turkey-EU relations, not only because of what has happened and what may happen in Turkey, but also because of the recent changes in Europe. In other words, Turkey has certainly changed a lot in the last 10 years, but so did Europe. with the global crisis, rising unemployment, the rise of immigration as an issue, the rise of anti-Islam sentiment, and more recently the rise of the far right in Europe has put center parties, even center-left parties, under a lot of pressure in Europe. And whether we like it or not, well, Europe is really not talking about Turkey's membership, and there are a lot more politicians today who are taking this opportunity, this political climate in Europe, to talk about excluding Turkey. So I think when we look at the next, not the very long term, the very long term, of course, many things can certainly happen, but in the medium term, I think perhaps it's, it's good to recognize, these problems not only here, but also the problems in Europe. And the problems in Europe, too, influence this relationship. For democracy, for basic freedoms, I believe we need to build bridges with Europe. And however, and I think some of the earlier speakers today have talked about this, we need to be realistic, and we need to think precisely in what terms and through what channels that we should build those bridges with Europe, and with what segments of Europe. Thank you.
We come back again to Turkish-EU relations, but now from a larger economic perspective, I should say. I wonder, possibly we'll have the chance to have Q&A, questions and answers following this talk. So one of my questions still before, immediately would be whether Europe was following a sort of a defensive political strategy after particularly the economic crisis that tries to persistently retreat and rather than maybe thinking in a much bigger sense through a new hegemony which requires also a political leadership of any sort, etc. So maybe we can try thinking about a much comprehensive context for thinking about Turkish-EU relations. So now the floor is Guy Bianman's.
Well, it's been really a great day, of course, for Atila. But I also share it because I am the privileged one. People talk in terms of 90s, 80s, 70s. I am honored, in this room at least, to have the privilege of knowing Atila from September, October 1968 onwards. Because we started together, and then it was only the Faculty of Economics and Administrative Sciences, and then we really became friends, long-time friends, from third year onwards, which more or less coincided with the 12th of March period, a rather turbulent area. But Professor Wessels talked in terms of 5 Atila, Zana at the 6. Okay, the 7th wonder was, he was a brilliant student. One that never took any notes, but took the best results always. And everybody including myself, was envious, of course. No, envious is different from jealous.
You're just making notes of this.
So that's one thing I always would remember. We used to work together. Another difference, he was a chain smoker. Good thing that he is not anymore. But apart from what mentioned our bondage in terms of being Galatasaray fans, that we did really share a lot in terms of our, how should I say, emergence from being undergrads, going to graduate studies in different countries, coming back, sharing all the time in different periods. And eventually, 10 years after our first meeting in '68, happens to be that along with our beloved Marian, 3 of us joined the then Department of Political Science together, October '78, 10 years on exactly. And again, it was, we were sharing a lot. Fatih Tayfur talked about it, so I won't get into details. But the thing is, I'll say something which probably I would have ended up with. There's a need, I think, for Atila, I wouldn't call it even semi-retirement, free time to do whatever he wants to do. Link these two different lines of social interest, academic interest together from now on. Political economy and Turkey-EU relations. Because everybody talked about it, because, he spent his lifetime, in a sense, from undergraduate days onwards, and I think there's time now to link these two together in the future, and hopefully together. If we could collaborate, I'll be more than pleased. Now, one other thing which needs to be mentioned for Atila, they talked about his contributions to the Department of IR, which I regret, because it wasn't to be split into two. Politics and IR should never be. It was a product of York, which I definitely regret, but of course, it doesn't deny the importance of contributions he made to the development of the department. But something should be added. Since we're putting it into a historical perspective, in a sense, in addition to what has already been said since the morning, it was those heady days of Onikeilu, and we agreed to disagree. Not only two of us, but many members of the faculty, in terms of what to do in the context of these, when our professors, mostly from Ankara University, but also very few, but nonetheless from our university, being given the so-called yellow envelopes. We did agreed to disagree. I think Şevket also shared it in his campus in Ankara University, whether or not we should leave our posts or remain and try to continue what we thought it was important to do. Okay, that didn't change our friendships, our contacts, and our shared sort of academic interests. But I was the one who left and came back more than 14 years later and found Atila having produced his new baby. I call it that way, Center for European Studies. It was his baby. IR department wasn't his baby. He built it up. But Center for European Studies was his baby, probably with the contribution from retired Professor Ali Gitmez from our faculty, and through him, actually, I found myself increasingly involved in something called not EU studies, but European studies. And thanks to him, I happened to be in that chair of graduate program of European studies. And through which we did a number of research projects. And what I'm going to very briefly share with you is a very modest offshoot of that long journey, in a sense, of a rather recent period, in the sense that I've been the local coordinator of a 5-year-long Framework 7 project entitled Financialization, Society and Economic and Sustainable Development, which ended only a few months ago. and there was a series of work as a partner of a much larger project, and it became important to us, and as an offshoot of that FP7 project, we recently produced with my colleague and former student of ours, both of ours, Dr. Osman Güzel, a paper, some points of which I could only share with you. Some points already been made by Şevket, so simplified my task, I suppose. What we intend to do is, could be described as putting Turkey-EU relationships into a historical perspective by adopting a critical political economy perspective. Why we say that? Because there has been, Atila already been mentioned by a number of speakers this morning, one of the pioneers of bringing a new perspective into the study of EU-Turkey relations, having been gone through his PhD and subsequent work and courses he taught. Fatih went into details, and matters of political economy or international political economy, and then his new area of specialization emerging from the late 80s onwards, and so he was a pioneer on that field, and many others joined in, including many of his former students, that it turns out to be, when you look at it in perspective, and he himself also made that observation in terms of his recent papers, that Turkey relations, in a sense, has become an industry, an academic industry on its own. A very attractive field of inquiry for many scholars, mostly Turkish, but also significantly from outside Turkey. And basically, whether in terms of comprehensive political narratives on the history of the relations, as well as the scenarios for the future. He also mentioned the ongoing project, Future, as they called it. And it coincided, if you look at it in the context of the last 15, 20, less than 20, but over the last decade and a half, roughly speaking, with the rather, how shall I say, trendy topic, probably losing its early appeal, but a product of a, if you like, new institutionalist conceptualization to be labeled as Europeanization. And there has, increasingly, in the context of the sub-periodization that Şevket already made, an emerging discussion on the part of the Turkey-EU specialists, what they call de-Europeanization of Turkey as a candidate country. So, Osman and I, when we look at the literature and in their own, I suppose, modest way, attempted to provide a particular, if you like, synopsis of it, we realize that, yes, these are the main sort of elements of the literature so far, and it is hard to say that there wasn't any, what could be considered in the broader picture of political economy, but more in terms of what could be more accurately described as institutionalist political economy perspective, rather than a critical political economy perspective. And in that respect, there is a need to develop more, and our paper was, in a sense, a preliminary step in that direction, not necessarily a full sort of developed study, that the need to develop a critical perspective that focuses on the linkages between Turkey's accession process to the EU and its experience of neoliberal transformation. It is also interesting that, put it in his own way, in terms of political and economic, it is almost schizophrenic, I would say. That's not something probably Osman would agree, but anyway, that there is so much emphasis on the economic benefits that the Turkey relations could bring, and they were important in many respects. But as well as, how shall I say, referring to the EU as, how shall I say, as an exogenous variable which may hopefully make a positive impact in terms of the Turkish politics. So there was this differentiation, but the interesting point about it is that the way in which the EU has evolved post-Maastricht especially, and in the context of the so-called financial global crisis of the last decade, that it became itself in need of a particular solution strategies to overcome its own crisis. So much so that important observers of the scene from a critical political economic perspective, such as Perry Anderson, identifying the EU as a neoliberal construction whose reform of it is no longer seriously conceivable. You may agree or disagree with that, but what I'm trying to get at is that there has very little in terms of Turkey-EU relations to focus on it. That's why I call Atila to get back into it. Now,
Challenge. Challenge.
Wow. Okay, so as I said, there are different aspects of it which I won't get into it, but we should also note that Turkey-EU relations has been unfortunately going through a rather acrimonious phase well before what we have been experiencing, witnessing, observing, however one's position might be, over the last few months, or if you want to say over the last 12 months or so. In a sense, we have been experiencing, just refreshing our memories, everybody well with, as one British journalist, commentator put it, even before the latest episode, or shenanigans as he put it, of the bovine crisis with Netherlands, where, I quote, Turkey's Red Meat Producers Association said it was expelling 40 Holstein cattle. Therefore, Dutch cows, like Dutch diplomats, were no longer welcome in Turkey. You don't need these, let alone what's been taking place over the last few days, if not 2 weeks. There was this deterioration of the relations between the EU as a set of institutions and the present political leadership. Whether you want to identify it with a particular party in power or not is beside the point. So, what is interesting in terms of analysis of the academic writings as well, long gone were the optimistic scenarios from outside and inside, which called for a new start, not back in the 2000s, but in the wake of the Eurozone crisis of the 2008 onwards, that that it could provide, however, is another matter, a unique opportunity, quote, to revitalize the moribund EU-Turkey relationship. Because it was argued that the Eurozone crisis could have necessitated a process of reinvention for the EU by creating new institutional flexibilities that might have rescued its relationship with Turkey from its impasse. And indeed, as everybody knows, these relations had already been going through a patchy phase. Sarkozy and all that, Şevket mentioned, I don't need to go into it. In the context of European Union's enlargement policy, from being a candidate country, increasingly characterized or depicted as a strategic partner. Now, what has been depicted as a landmark deal regarding this Syrian and other refugee questions into Europe in exchange for economic aid and a promise of a grant visa-free travel to Turkish citizens within the Schengen zone, I think was a good manifestation of that perception of the shift from being a candidate country in the context of enlargement to a so-called strategic partner. And in fact, I think all this made us to rethink and were studying the process in terms of whether or not it is plausible to attribute a so-called transformative power to the European Union in the context of its enlargement process. And this notion, by the way, is not of our own making. It is European Commission's itself terminology, which I will say a few things in a minute. So, in that regard, need to go over the different phases of it. Şevket already differentiated, but just to remind ourselves that in the context of the 2000 accession, or what was then called actually pre-accession, it is plausible to say that EU Commission's accession partnership for Turkey was set to clarify a roadmap that would circumscribe its economic criteria with the implementation of the structural reform program that Turkish government at the time agreed with both the IMF and the World Bank. And in fact, it was repeatedly acknowledged by the EU that, as it emphasized the accession partnership, providing an impetus and new focus to the cooperation between Turkey and the international financial institutions. In that sense, it is possible to say that the first half, which more or less coinciding with Şevket's first period, the crisis management strategies of the Bretton Woods institutions considered as being functional for enabling Turkey to fulfill the Copenhagen economic criteria and the subsequent priorities of the accession partnership of the EU. This was acknowledged by the EU, but when it stated that cooperation between Turkey and the international financial institutions is receiving an impetus, a new focus through the accession partnership, etc., etc. So there was this kind of a, if you like, division of labor, which, of course, brought into the picture the emphasis Şevket already mentioned, the so-called political criteria in terms of the accession, or pre-accession and subsequently post-accession phases of that. Now, how am I doing time-wise? I haven't checked, so. Now, in that respect, we have to go a little back in history and remind ourselves, not all the way from the 50s, 60s, whatever, but in the context of what was taking place from the late 70s onwards. Because Turkish then EC relationship was frozen 2 years before the coup in 1980, and it would remain frozen for about a decade until Özal government applied for full membership. But application meant disregarding what has preceded it over the last, nearly 25 years ago or so, from the Ankara Agreement onwards. Because Ankara Agreement process was going through different phases, and it was frozen in the late 70s, and full membership, whether or not it was really meant to be something to be taken seriously is another matter, but completely setting a new direction, or a new process at least. So, but the important thing is that it would coincide in Özal's rhetoric, Fuat was talking about rhetoric and knowledge in that respect in the morning, that conception of the integration with the world economy becoming an end in itself at a time when Turkey-EC relations was in the fridge, so to speak. So it was important to take this into account in the way in which, more than a decade later, when the sort of relationship with the granting of the candidate status would be how shall I say, subcontracting the economic criteria to IMF and the World Bank. But something else has happened, as I'm sure everybody is aware, in the mid-1990s, returning to the early 70s customs union. Now, it is interesting that, from the EU perspective then, in the context of a period where EU was very preoccupied with the German unification, with what was taking place in Eastern Europe, etc., the customs union, from the EU perspective, post-Maastricht EU, did not present any prospect of full membership. By contrast, from the Turkish policymakers as well as academic observers' point of view, CEU was seen as a step forward for full membership in the future. The contrast, as everybody there to see, it's too easy to see. And actually, it is definitely, to quote one academic observer, considered as a transitional arrangement to strengthen the Turkish economy on the way to full EU membership. Nothing could be further from truth as far as the EU was concerned. However, it would not prevent other economic observers from presenting this, that is EU, as an external anchor. It would gain much more currency, of course, from 2000s onwards, but even in the context of this custom union relationship starting in the mid-1990s, there was this, how shall I say, analogy being made with this notion of anchor. And by the way, the anchor analogy is not coming out of blue. It was part and parcel of IMF. Not necessarily per se for Turkey, but generally as part of its 1990s so-called strategy for using exchange rate as an anchor for anti-inflationary policy. It was simply a paraphrasing from it into the Turkey-EU relations in the context of custom union and what followed. Anyway, so we know the story, candidate status given, etc. So, with the start of the 2000s, December 99, just to refresh our memories again, is a very critical month. Turkey-EU candidacy granted in Helsinki, but also the same month, I'm not sure which one was which, first, Turkey, after nearly, with the exception of 94 IMF agreement, after nearly 15 years, once again, agreeing a 3-year standby agreement. At a time when there was no balance of payment crisis on the horizon. So that's what set to, in a sense, increasing the intermingling processes. So we argued with Osman in that paper that from that point onwards, EU accession process in fact became an empty signifier for both economic and political change, as well as for political and economic stability, while it gained support of different segments of the Turkish society, from the business community to trade union movement, albeit for a variety of different reasons. For the business circles, to very quickly summarize, potential membership implied a mechanism to ensure macroeconomic stability, which is considered indispensable for the continued capital inflows, while it revealed at the same time the vulnerability of the Turkish economy to such flows. It underlined the saliency of maintaining the country's creditworthiness in the eyes of international financial investors. So, it was imperative for especially the big conglomerates to get access to such savings. I asked you, and you said okay. I did ask you. Okay, 2 or 3 minutes. I did ask you. Anyway, so that side aside, for I should mention from the point of view of the trade unions or the working class movement, it was important because it was considered that only through that it would be possible to allow the changes in the Turkish sort of industrial relations legislation, which will make it compatible with the EU. Of course, it's again interesting because to refer to European standards was rather problematic because it wasn't a matter which would be sort of valid across the EU countries anyway, in the context of the early 2000s. But that was this, reflected both in ILO and more generally, that to be European, to achieve European standards in industrial relations gaining significance. But due respect to Atila, it was important, as he mentioned in the very frequently quoted article he wrote in 2009, The Role of Temporality and Interaction in the Turkey-EU Relations, that prospective EU membership was to be understood for producing a powerful discourse and impetus for change in Turkey. That sums it up, that for the business as well as for the working class movement, it was perceived as such. Whether it had any reality, any contact with reality is another matter. So rhetoric gains significance as well for it. And it was taken on board, of course, by the AKP government up to a point in time. But the outside observers, which included European observers as well, and the Turkish, what I call liberal intelligentsia, was also attributing a quality to this Europeanization process, where they portrayed the enlargement process as a powerful mechanism triggering economic and political transformation in countries such as Turkey, but with an added dimension, or additional transformative power, if you want to call it that way, because it was attributed to this quality of transforming an Islamist political movement, I quote, it's not my wording, into a party that embraces the norms of liberal democracy. This was the discourse all the way until 2010 constitutional referendum in Turkey. So if it were to succeed in this endeavor, it would have had implications beyond Turkey, it was argued, because it would set a precedent by, quote, marrying one Muslim tradition with the idea of a secular, democratic, pro-European governance, hence coinage of the term, I quote, dubbing the process as Erdoganization. This is from, actually, Open Democracy website, signed by a long list of European and Turkish intellectuals. In short, EU accession process would have been celebrated in more ways than one for initiating a process of reforms. Okay, I'll skip a lot and come back to the end in the sense that Atila again mentioned in that article that the way in which Turkey would be treated from 2007 onwards is that the way in which Turkish candidacy would be treated, quote, entailing stricter conditions and fewer incentives for the Turkish case, for instance, when it is compared with its compatriot Croatia's accession process. He was quite on the spot in that. And it turns out to be because at the same time, and we were working in a project at the time at the Center for European Studies, we realized Turkey was categorized with the so-called Western Balkan countries in terms of IPA. While Croatia, being a Western Balkan country, was not part of IPA. Although both at the time were supposedly taking along this process of accession as negotiations. So there were already significant differences in the way in which, jumping to the end, what we called the accession process being put on hold, led us to the point of the impact of EU on the political process. Standard thing. Whether or not it would be an instigator or impetus for establishing what, the trendy terminology at the time, establishing civilian control over the military, so that the tutelary controls of the military and judiciary, on what you may speculate, but that was the jargon, vasiyet, not vasiyet, vesayet, vasiyet is almost more permanent. And so to end it, but the thing is, to cut a long story short, what happened Sunday night? You judge it for yourself in terms of this tutelary debate. So, coming back to the basic point where we are, in a sense, in terms of whether or not it is a candidate country or strategic partner, interestingly, again, Atila and Nilgün and others, Meliha, all in terms of their recent work, were underlining the point that it's really increasingly being difficult to say that Turkish-EU relations were making a positive impact, not only domestically, but to the extent that it was earlier attributed the quality of a soft power in the region, in its neighborhood, or whatever, the jargon. So, what we are end up with? Modernization of customs union agreement. Back to basics, you may wonder, but not quite. Why? Because the Commission made it very clear that the modernization of the customs union, in fact, would remain as an alternative to full membership rather than accelerator of the accession process, as long as the political criteria was remained on the sidelines. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Eralp. There was a communication problem in the age of communication, in the era of communication. I think we had the privilege to hear about the rise of the critical political economy school to EU-Turkish relations now in this panel, and we hope Atila Hoca to join the club in his semi-retirement. Now I want to give the floor questions and answers.
Maybe we can have a couple of questions.
Okay, so maybe we can have a questions and answers session for a short while.
I want to ask a question. Do you see any connections between 2001 program and crisis of Turkey we experience these days? And maybe related to this, you make a division between the periods of 83 years, and you say after the 2007 there is a different time. Why do you say this? Which indicator, which structural change occurred in these days in 2007? Thank you.
That was one question actually I was going to ask, but you know, I really liked your paper, but I also felt like I missed listening to you. It was nice to hear you. And as a matter of fact, this, you know, going back all those days and you know, sort of talking about the agrarian peasantry debate, coming back here was great. My question actually is in this context is the following. You know, now the more I read about globalization, the more I see that one of the very significant debate in it right now is about land grabbing, food and water. And so what you are saying, what does it mean in terms of, for instance, these days land grabbing thing? And if the land is limited and there's a big impact on the land, then what that say about, you know, your argument? And then secondly, there is also another focus in globalization that you are actually referring to. You know, that is globalization is becoming more and more urbanized, like Turkey. And then, as a matter of fact, the indication is, you know, 2030, we are going to talk about globalization as urbanization. So I see these two trends, you know, happening at the same time in the context of what you are talking about: land grabbing on the one hand, and highly urbanized, you know. On the, so, what do you say about this? Just to let you, you know, sort of go a bit more in what you are saying. And you know, in terms of what Şevket and Galip said, I agree with you. Like this, you know, the main thing was political. I agree, and there is actually not much impact on it. But you know, maybe two things. One actually is this, you know, Europeanization is different levels. And I work on urbanization in Anatolia, and Anatolians, these are new middle classes. And for instance, when you talk to them, they actually pay attention to the EU, you know, anchor in a very economic way. So, you know, what happens when you look at the different economic sectors, you know, rather than Turkey as a whole. And also, yes, there is a movement from full membership to strategic, partnership. I call it my recent writings buffer state, sort of this old kind of Turkish foreign policy to contain, ISIL, contain refugees. But if you actually lose the EU anchors, then what is your alternative to it? Like what makes Turkey more stable without those anchors?
Any other questions?
Yes. I'm Atila Sant'Agostino, I'm Italian. I'm teaching presently at the University where I'm the chair. My question is for Professor Pamuk. Well, actually, it's not exactly a question, but it will allow a brief comment on what we said with a small addition. I surely share your view concerning the mistakes of Europe when the process of negotiation started. The couple Merkel-Sarkozy actually impeded the sound development of this process of negotiation, and Europe gave up its possibility to influence on Turkey. So, but let me add a little more addition. How safe would have been if I'm Italian? The president of the Italian premier in those years was Silvio Berlusconi, who was a good friend of the then Premier Erdogan, and also was a good friend of Putin. And Berlusconi was the one who supported strongly the membership of Turkey, as it was supporting closer relations with the US. The reaction was that this furthest alliance between Merkel and Sarkozy led Merkel to organize a sort of complot against Berlusconi, which ended with his resignation and came the Monti government. So my conclusion is, if Europe had accepted or gone according to the indication of Berlusconi, today we would have a completely different view concerning the process, concerning a completely different condition, situation concerning the process of accession of power. That's all. Thank you. We also had a coup in Italy. But the difference is it didn't fail.
Okay, any other questions? Okay,
Right. I'm glad for you asking this question. Only yesterday I was teaching my undergraduate students about land grabbing. This is one of the things I showed. The reason for land grabbing is obviously there is a realization that first of all there isn't enough land for food production, and therefore countries like China, Saudi Arabia, and so on have been trying to buy land in other countries. But the second main reason is that for land grabbing, when land is actually bought in other countries, mainly the land is used for biofuel production. And as you can see, China, as a country, has got land in Cameroon, in Tanzania, in Uganda, and also not only transnational corporations have been buying land in other countries, in other words, land buying from north to south, but also there has been south to south land grabbing as well. For instance, Indians have been buying, also Thailand has been buying things in Malaysia and so on. And the land grabbing has become a significant point because land is really not repeatable, is not expandable, and so on. Therefore, dominant powers use their economic and financial power to go and buy and control the lands of other countries. Obviously, China is the new power, economically and financially, and there is a realization that even the Chinese vast land may not be enough in the future. Therefore, they have been sort of trying to find other ways. Urbanization, yes, simply because I was saying that, you know, with the commercialization and capitalization of agriculture, and basically people, two processes have been sort of fueled. One process is de-agrarianization, that people are moving agriculture and therefore going to urban areas. Now, until very recently, in the third world, rural population was more than urban population. I think from the last 2 years onwards, if you look at the world population, urban population has actually increased. Now it's more than rural population. And that tendency, unfortunately, is going to continue with obviously population growth and so on. And because land is not expandable, and then the land also has been losing its carrying capacity. With all these commercialized agriculture, use of insecticides, pesticides, chemicals, and so on, people may not be able to find a way of livelihood in the countryside. Therefore, they are moving to urban areas, and you are absolutely right, there has been a very significant trend towards urbanization. Now, in the past, world's poor would exist in rural areas, but now world's poor are actually going to sort of urban areas. There's one Latin American writer who talks about cities of peasants that migrate into urban areas. I wonder if this is sufficient for you.
I will try to respond very quickly. I want to make 3 points. One, at the end of the day, 2001 program represents a break with the earlier emphasis on markets, the so-called market fundamentalism period of neoliberal policies. So it brings in now some new institutions to regulate markets. But it was all two things. One, it was also a program to stabilize the economy, and B, it was at the end of the day a short, medium-term program. I think we can't really look back and say that 2001 program will then do everything by itself, will take care of the course of Turkey's economic development for the following decades. My argument is that from 2007 on, after a few years of this stabilization, whoever is in power, I think, then has to deal with issues of long-term economic development, but AKP government was really not interested. You could say, well, they wouldn't have done much anyway. But for AKP government, they enjoyed the short-term benefits of the program in terms of economic stability. I also think a good part of that economic growth early on was due to the fact that the economy had done very poorly in the previous decade, so there was a lot of built-up, pent-up demand and capacity to invest and so on. So they took all those things concentrated in those early years. Okay. They enjoyed that, and I think they presented as the AKP success. Okay. But then, when they could have done things about longer economic policies, then they were interested in purely politics. And to this day it continues. My expectation is that politics will continue to drive economic policies, or whatever serves as economic policy. It's not really economic policy, it is drive for power that is driving economic policy. Now, with respect to the, and so my sense, why 2007, that's not a precise date, but the onset of the global crisis, domestic issues, the attack against the military, those trials and so on, they signal a turning point for the drive to consolidate power, and that's why I choose somewhere there. But you can see the impact of this on growth rates. If you compare growth rates for the period up to 2007 with the growth rates since 2008, they are very, very different. Finally, with respect to Europeanization, my understanding of European influence is that this perspective of membership does not automatically lead to good things here. I think this perspective of membership gives greater agency, greater mobilization, greater incentives to domestic forces. And I would argue that if Turkey really had a European perspective from 2005, membership perspective, that could have had also an impact on Turkey's domestic politics. If European Union, let me exaggerate for the sake of the argument, if European Union really did say, if you fulfill these conditions, these are the conditions that apply to all members, you fulfill them, you become a member, then domestic politics in Turkey could be different, because there would be greater motivation inside Turkey to demand those things. But it was much easier for the government to discredit the EU program, the EU perspective, because it wasn't really there.
Okay, but please don't derive a wrong conclusion that there is an alternative way of Turkey looking for alternative partners or whatever. No. First of all, the EU itself is trying to, how shall I say, to leave behind this protracted crisis, different phases of it. Eurozone crisis, now the Brexit crisis, and God knows what will follow in the case of changes of government in major European countries, etc. But what is important is that as it is becoming quite clear, day by day, in terms of what's happening in Turkey. Yes, they are very scared, disillusioned is, to put it very mildly, as reflected in a number of observers. Some with certain official posts, some ex-ministers, ex-ambassadors, and all the rest of that, a full list. But I'll just quote one thing. Sorry. This is BBC World Service, outside source program, Monday evening. I couldn't catch the BBC's commentator, but more or less, as I tried to take it down, he was saying, this is Europe's moment.